The country is mourning the loss of a widely respected lawmaker and powerful voice on Capitol Hill. Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, died early this morning at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. He was 68 years old and had faced a series of health issues. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are remembering their beloved colleague.
Today is a very sad day for us as we all awaken to the sad news of the passing of our dear friend, revered and respected colleague, Congressman, Mr. Chairman Elijah Cummings of Maryland, my brother in Baltimore. He was in the Congress. Elijah was considered a North Star. He was a leader of towering character and integrity.
I mean, it's hard to measure the enormity of this loss to us. He was Maryland's favorite son. He was the heart and the soul of our delegation in Maryland.
The country has lost a great patriot and a great human being, a very decent, patriotic representative who has been an extraordinary leader all of his life. One thing that is surely true is he was one of the best of us. It is a great loss to our country.
Over more than 2 decades in the House of Representatives, Cummings became a living legend in his native Baltimore. By all accounts, he was a powerful and passionate voice on the national stage and a strong advocate for his neighbors, his district, and his values. He counted close friends and admirers from all across the political spectrum.
The flags at the U.S. Capitol and the White House were lowered to half-staff to honor the 13-term congressman. Cummings served on the Oversight and Reform Committee under 4 different presidents. As chairman, he was a key figure in the investigation into President Trump that made him a target of the president's criticism. But today, President Trump offered his condolences. In a tweet, he called Congressman Cummings a, quote, highly respected political leader, and said his work and voice on so many fronts will be very hard, if not impossible, to replace. Eugene Scott is a political reporter for the Washington Post. He joins me now from Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, Eugene. What is Congressman Cummings' legacy in his hometown of Baltimore?
His legacy primarily in Baltimore is that he was a lawmaker who really advocated for marginalized people in the country's urban areas. Baltimore is almost synonymous with Cummings on Capitol Hill, but he also fought for people in cities that weren't Baltimore but had similar challenges. Some of the policy ideas that were closest to his heart that seemed to be very city-specific in many ways were related to policing and gun violence, but also healthcare-related issues, working to provide access to those who do not normally have access to health care. He was also just known for just bringing the ideas of people who, in general, perhaps weren't represented well in conversations on Capitol Hill to tables of power. And I think it was in part his upbringing. He's from Baltimore, but his parents were sharecroppers in South Carolina. And so he comes from a background of impoverished people who really depended on policy makers to improve their lives.
Yeah, and let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, his personal story really is remarkable. How did the son of sharecroppers rise to become one of the most prominent Democratic members of the House?
Well, it seemed like determination and will was a good part of it. As a young kid, he was told because of some speaking challenges that he would never perhaps have a career as public as he currently does by educators, actually. But he went on to be a great orator in the Maryland House and a lawmaker. And his parents were preachers, and you could often hear something similar in the way he communicated his convictions when he was on Capitol Hill advocating for an idea. But he would also point to community and support systems that played a big part in his success. He went to Howard University, a well-known historically black college here in Washington, D.C., and his much of his tuition was paid for by a former boss of his in a drugstore when he was a teenager. And so he really took that idea that community mattered and played a big role in the success of individuals with him to Capitol Hill.
And as our viewers may recall, back in February, Congressman Cummings defended his Republican colleague, Mark Meadows, and surprised some when he called him one of his best friends. Well, today, Congressman Meadows tweeted, "There was no stronger advocate and no better friend than Elijah Cummings. I am heartbroken for his wonderful family and staff. Please pray for them. I will miss him dearly." Eugene, what does that unexpected relationship tell us about the character of Elijah Cummings?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Cummings was a liberal in his worldview and his advocacy, but he certainly was one of the few lawmakers on either side of the aisle who had genuine friendships with people on the other side of the aisle. And part of that is because he really tried to refrain from caricatures and painting his political opponents by some of their worst stereotypes, but really tried to understand the values that they held, that he shared, that shaped the policies and ideas that they promoted. And that allowed him to work well with people on the other side of the aisle. Individuals like Trey Gowdy, who we know last week very briefly was the latest personal attorney for President Trump, spoke very highly of Representative Cummings. And you can't help but to wonder if there are that many other Democrats or Republicans left on the Hill who would have the same reaction if they were to pass anytime soon.
Right. No, that is an excellent question. Well, here's what South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn said about his friend and fellow Congressman Elijah Cummings.
It's no question in my mind, but that his death leaves a void. I hope that that void can be filled adequately to continue the work. There are a lot of people on that committee who are really good people. They were good supporters of his, and several of them can become leaders of that committee in their own right. But sure, there's going to be a void. We're all going to mourn for a while, but the country must go forward.
Eugene, what about that notion? What type of void does Cummings' passing leave on the Hill?
Well, I mean, he was passionate in terms of his responsibilities related to oversight. He really took the job seriously, the role and responsibility to keep an eye on the executive branch and other parts of government to make sure that they weren't being abused, that American constituents weren't being taken advantage of. And so there's going to be a strong desire that he be replaced long term with someone who shares that same worldview. That'll be very difficult right now. Things seem very partisan, and even when they're not, we know that the president and his allies have made it seem as if partisan motivations guide the leader of the Oversight Committee when they are a Democrat above all else. And that is something that will be undergirding perhaps this entire conversation about impeachment and the investigations related to it as we move forward.
All right, Eugene Scott in Washington for us.